Welcome to My Psychedelic Roots, a podcast of conversations with people from a broad swath of lived experience to explore their psychedelic beginnings or roots. What led them to start using psychedelics, what those early experiences were like, and how those roots have impacted their life's unfolding. My name is Amy Bartlett, and it is my hope that these stories, generously shared by my guests, offer perspective and insight into the lived reality of psychedelic experiencing. And so whoever, wherever, or whenever you are, welcome. I'm glad you're here. In this episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with my dear friend Doris Payer, a neuroscientist and knowledge broker who has over 25 years of experience working in the field of substance use and addiction. Doris has worn many hats over the years. From a rave kid and community harm reduction pioneer in the 90s, to becoming an academic research scientist using brain imaging to understand addiction, to serving as knowledge mobilizer, supporting evidence-informed policies, programs, and decisions. However, in our conversation together, we dive deeply into her personal journey with psychedelic substances and how her evolving relationship to them has impacted not just her career choices, but more importantly, perhaps, her relation to herself, her psyche, and her spirit. In my experience, Doris is a person who cares deeply about people and making sense of the world, and is passionate about ensuring everyone has the information they need to make choices that are right for them in order to thrive. In our conversation, we talk about her recreational substance use in the 90s rave scene in Detroit, after immigrating to the U.S. from Austria in her early teens, and how those experiences compared with her first, more intentional guided journey with MDMA, which she did on her 40th birthday. And this contrast is part of what I really admire about Doris. Despite all of her studying and accomplishments, she is also someone who is happy to be proven wrong when new information becomes available, and to revel in these discoveries with humility, respect, and joyfulness. It was lovely to have the opportunity to sit down together and wend our way through her unique story. And so, let's hear more about Doris's psychedelic roots. Welcome, Doris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Yes. So as we jump into our conversation today, I wonder, what do you think it's important that people know about you and your background in your life before we move into exploring your first psychedelic experience?
Sure. So, a bit about my background. I'm an addiction neuroscientist by training. And so I have studied how drugs work in the brain. That is sort of my academic background. But nowadays, I'm more interested in knowledge mobilization, which is making knowledge, evidence meaningful and relevant to people who need to hear about it, which is in a way what we're doing here today. And psychedelics have been part of that academic and professional journey, and obviously also personal journeys. So it's a big topic in my life. So I'm excited to talk about it more.
Yeah, that's cool. And so obviously psychedelics are a part of your life. And I'm curious, if we pull a thread back, where would that thread tie for you? How was your way of seeing the world? How were drugs talked about or thought about in your childhood? What was that context like for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can start in childhood there. I don't have a lot of access to who I was when I was a little kid. But
Mm-hmm.
what I think is relevant here is, and what I didn't mention in the introduction, I'm from Austria originally, and my family moved to the US when I was 14. And that is the beginning. It's the beginning of a lot of things. It was a very difficult experience for me, and also a pathway in many ways to psychedelics. And so moving from Europe to the US when I was 14, moving anywhere when you're 14 is difficult. And I felt like an outsider. Things didn't make sense. I didn't really speak the language. I didn't understand the culture. I felt very isolated. And also coming from Europe, I was into electronic music. It's just what was on the radio there. And so when we moved to the US, I went looking for electronic music, and it wasn't really popular in the US at the time. And I was told, you're going to have to go to a warehouse downtown. You're going to have to find yourself a rave. And so in my search for, connection to something that felt familiar, which was the music, I wound up in the rave scene. And there are a lot of drugs in the rave scene, including psychedelics.
What did you think about drugs before you entered the rave scene? Were they something that were taboo? Did you ever talk about them or experience them in Austria before your move? What was your relationship to substances?
I don't think I had much of one. There was a bit of drinking because, you could get peach schnapps at the gas station. And so, I mean, not legally, but so that was part of it. But at 14, I wasn't really exposed to that much drug stuff that I can remember. So I don't think it was on my mind very much.
Do you remember what it felt like to enter the rave scene and see people taking drugs or being offered drugs?
It just felt like that's kind of what was part of the community. And so coming back to my earlier point about, some of these factors coming together, right? Like trying to find that familiarity on music and trying to find community and trying to feel less like an outsider and trying to feel part of something. And the rave scene was that. And so drugs were around and part of the culture of it. And so I accepted and welcomed it as a part of the culture. And again, having had a really rough time with this move, I often didn't want to experience my difficult reality. And so it was a welcome opportunity to find community and step away from the difficult feelings that were coming up around
Yeah.
the move. So I was nervous about it, probably, as something unfamiliar and risky. And I'm not, in many ways, I'm not an impulsive person. And so, I wanted to think about it and learn about it. And I did, and eventually ended up, studying it and making a career of it. But yeah, so I did some self education, but it was just part of what was done in this community that I wanted to be a part of.
Yeah. And so did you find community, and what role did psychedelics play in that exploration and encounter with others?
Yes, I did find community, and I think they played a massive role because I still feel deeply connected to many of these people to this day. And at the time, so the psychedelics that were mostly being used was MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, and mostly to get weird with your friends or have fun with your friends. And there wasn't much of an explicit spiritual aspect. But that said, I do think that, the medicine worked and there were some hard opening moments and there were moments of connection. And I think because of this shared experience of getting weird together or the shared experience of being up all night, it's shared experience that brings people closer together, right? And this kind of common understanding and common knowledge of the weirdness that psychedelics brought us at the time are a point of connection. It opened up doors to greater connection or connection about other things in life. And so, you know, the rave scene was also, and that's why I felt I wanted to be part of that scene because it was all a bunch of weirdos and misfits and, people who were looking for something other than the mainstream that wasn't offering them what they needed. And so yeah, I it was a way of finding my people.
Do you have one or two experiences that you can remember that were particularly touching or heartwarming for you, or ones that were particularly weird, or ones that were particularly connecting that your friends and yourself still talk about?
There's a few that I could talk about. I mean, there was the practice of going to the raves and being up all night and using psychedelics. But then as I became closer friends with some of these people, we would also sometimes go to the park and take mushrooms. And those are the more hard opening experiences where we had deep conversations with each other and sort of had insights about the universe that we talk about to this day. And so, yeah, there were moments like that. Or on the more party time, silly side, just, the time we were up for however many hours and I don't know, started seeing things and it's something to laugh about. And yeah, I think those are all valid.
Of course. It sounds like you had some deep connections with others and finding community and finding your place. I'm curious if your relationship with yourself changed at all in this period of your life.
I think in the sense that I felt part of something and that I felt validated in my existence and yeah, that I didn't feel like an alone outsider.
You came to this space wanting community and you found it. And that finding of what you're looking for can be transformative.
Yeah, I don't know if it was transformative about how I felt about myself, but it was transformative about how I felt about my place in things and the people I was surrounded by. And like I said, being part of something and it's something that I take with me and I'm deeply grateful for to this day. And so I got an enormous amount of value out of that time, but it was not introspective. And so, we talked a bit about the what would the book chapters be
Yes.
called? And this chapter for me is called Down the Hatch Party Time. And it was just very externally focused, right? You take the psychedelics, but then you focus on your friends that you're getting weird with and the music and the experience of the party. And there wasn't a lot of introspection, at least on my part. So I take away from it the connections and the belonging.
Yes.
But I don't know if I feel like it gave me insight into myself
Mhm.
at the time.
Yes.
Foreshadowing.
And so, on the back of those experiences, you did decide to pursue studies and research and a career in the substance use space. And I know that in that foreshadowing way, your relationship with psychedelics has shifted somewhat. And so I'm curious, this pathway from the rave scene to your studies to this next chapter you're now in, and how that pathway evolved for you.
Hmm. So part of what I was doing in the rave scene was harm reduction. So I was working with Dance Safe and with Maps at the time a little bit because, I was seeing people at raves taking risks with substances, including psychedelics, and not really understanding what they were doing to their body or how they interacted or, the idea of set and setting and, what could go wrong. And so some friends and I started a little dance safe chapter to provide information about the substances and about how they work in the brain and also we're checking people's drugs for contaminants, that sort of thing. And that felt really important. And, as I mentioned, like I was looking into these substances before I was using them. And so because of that, I had a body of knowledge that I felt was worth sharing even back then. And then, once we had the Dance Safe chapter going, I just wanted to be a knowledgeable advocate for this kind of education and this kind of knowledge is power movement. And in order to be a good advocate for it, I decided to go to school for it. And so I was actually originally a French major in university, and then I
Mhm.
switched to biopsychology to study drugs and thought processes and those kinds of more human scientific things. And yeah, that pathway took me through a PhD to study drugs and brains and how drugs worked in the brain, because I thought at the time that getting people to understand that substance use is a brain thing and not a morals thing, then surely they have to make reasonable drug policy, which is not how drug policy works. But that was my reasoning at the time. So yeah, I just really wanted to understand really well how drugs worked in the brain and how they impacted behavior. And then in my academic career, I kind of lost touch with the community that I wanted to inform in the first place that really got me interested in this. And so I left academia. And the whole time up until then, through DanceSafe and through my connection with MAPS, I'd been keeping up with psychedelic science. And so I was aware. And like this is the 90s and early 2000s. So just the beginnings of the kind of psychedelic science research on possible treatments for mental health disorders and what have you. And it was just very few and far between studies, but I was aware of them and just keeping an eye on them and not too involved. But then when I left academia, I went to work at the Beckley Foundation, and that was my re-entry into psychedelic science more fully, and getting to know the research and the policy advocacy that was going on around it and getting intimately familiar with that. And so when I came back to Canada after being in the UK to work at the Beckley Foundation, it was just uh, more on my radar. And at that time, I was starting to consider using it for myself therapeutically in this more introspective way. And then it took another couple of years to get to that point. But just to say, to answer your question, that, I'd studied the neuroscience of it. I had shifted away from the neuroscience to get more into the mobilization of the knowledge, into policy, into practice. And so that's where I found myself at this place where I had my personal experience, but it felt kind of disconnected from the clinical progress that was being made, that had been on my radar. I had dipped in and out of it. But yeah, eventually I started considering it for myself. So this is where we find ourselves at the second chapter.
Yes, and what is the name of this chapter?
I named that chapter The Opening of Dimensions, which is very poetic, but I think it will make sense as I talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about it. What led you to finally take that step to working therapeutically with them? Who were you with? Where were you? What was the atmosphere like? Was it what you expected, etcetera? Yeah, walk us through it a bit.
Yeah, I have a lot of answers to all those questions. So this is now fast forward 30 years later. So this chapter starts a couple of years ago on my 40th birthday. So long gone are the raver days and those kinds of patterns of psychedelics use that we engaged in at the time. But the whole time, I've been struggling with depression, and had tried various therapy and medications and what have you, and was still struggling, and just so tired of struggling and not really finding the solutions. And because I had re-entered the world of psychedelic science more fully and gotten to know more about the current state of the science, I started to consider it for myself. And I started seeking someone who could do a session with me. And so I found an underground practitioner who had it was much more structured than any of my previous experiences would have been. So this was someone with an office and an intake form and, a whole different way of approaching it. And so that's what I wanted. I wanted someone who could guide me through an experience and see if this might be helpful. If it was so helpful for all those people and all those studies, then I thought maybe I could benefit from it as well.
Yeah. So you found the person you wanted to work with and you felt ready, armed with the information you needed and the context. And so tell us a little bit about that experience. What was it? Were you nervous? How did you arrive? How did you take the medicine? Which medicine did you take?
Yeah, I was nervous because I knew from the studies that, these might have been big experiences, but at the same time, I was also quite arrogant because I thought, I've done these things a million times, like what could possibly happen that I haven't already experienced. And so I had a couple of preparation sessions with this practitioner and talked a bit about what I was hoping to get out of it and my struggles. And they decided that MDMA would be the most appropriate. And I remember being so disappointed because I was like, oh my God, I was a raver. I've done MDMA hundreds of times. What could possibly happen that I haven't already experienced? So I remember very distinctly being disappointed, but also trusting this practitioner to know what they're doing. And it was it's such a shock looking back that this substance that I had experienced hundreds of times, it might as well have been a different drug. It was nothing like anything I had experienced. And so I'm really grateful that that's what they chose and that I got to see really the difference of what a substance can do when you're again down the hatch party time, outward directed, like outwardly focused versus doing the session with the eye shades and the headphones and really being focused on your inward experience and what a difference that makes. It's wild that it's the same, chemically the same compound, but a wildly different experience.
So what was the come up like for you?
The come up, it was hard to get in. And I remember this visual of like hands holding a gate shut. And it was really hard work to pry the hands off of the gate. And so obviously, something didn't want me in there. And so it took a lot of effort and it, took a booster dose and took whatever. But eventually the hands were pried off. And what was beyond those gates was a house. And in that house was a young version of me, like a little girl version of me. And yeah, I'll get into the story. I mean, some of it sounds so hokey, but it really was life transforming, that experience. So what lay inside was a house with this little girl version of me sort of curled up over her knees, kind of hunched over her knees. And when I invited her to sort of uncurl her position, she had this beautiful ball of light that she was holding. And yeah, a lot of things happen. And I feel like recounting that whole experience would be a whole podcast in and of itself. But I think the two main takeaways from that experience was this ball of light that this little girl was holding, and which I now understand as like the essence or the essential self, I guess, and recognizing it as just perfect and beautiful. And I had felt so broken, and realizing that I had this like perfect essence, just like everyone else, was a way of understanding that I'm not actually broken. And it was a really lovely reuniting and reconciling with this little girl version of myself. And I remember we just kind of hung out and felt this mutual joy and appreciation that the other version was there. And everything felt very genuine. And then I trusted it because both versions were me, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So it was a lovely reconciling with that version. And then the other thing I took away was that in this house, I saw my psyche in 3D, in three dimensions. And so this is like the first way that, this chapter name, the what did I call it? The opening of dimensions, how that fits in. So I saw my psyche in three dimensions. And, I'd been in therapy for like 20 years at that time. And I had talked all my hangups and neuroses and whatever assumptions and expectations. I had talked them to death, and I understood them. And I understood why I was the way I was. But in this experience, everything had a form. Everything was associated with an object that could be manipulated or like experienced in relation to other objects. And so it was actually the first time that I saw like why things were the way they were, or how they interacted with others, or how they came to be, or I don't know. Like one example I can think of is that in this house, because the little girl was kind of hunching over this ball of light, there were all these beautiful paintings and furniture and very expensive looking things. And I realized that, these are all my accomplishments that I've accumulated over the course of my lifetime, right? Like a PhD and I don't know, whatever else I can be proud of. And none of it mattered because it was dark. And so it I realized like it didn't matter if I would continue amassing accomplishments. Like that's not what's needed. What's needed is some light in the room so that they can be appreciated, or so that they can actually fulfill their purpose. So I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. It's just this way for things to be understood as objects that help me understand how they fit in with everything. And so yeah, and this is also why I'm maybe we'll get more into this later, but I think the timing was right in that I'm glad that I had done 20 years of therapy, because everything that I experienced made sense, and I could understand why it was there, and I could understand what it represented, and I can work with it into the future. And so yeah, I'm glad that I had intellectually gotten to the point where, okay, I get it. And this experience gave me a more experiential way of understanding them.
Mhm. That's beautiful. What a profound experience.
It really was. It was absolutely life transforming.
What kinds of things do you know about yourself or the world around you that are different now than they were before?
Yeah, everything. So, one big thing that I now know experientially is that I'm not broken, and seeing this perfect essence and experiencing that perfect essence and that beauty, I just know now in my body that that's there. Now, mind you, it's covered up with layers and layers and layers of shit, right? Like, there's still all my experiences and all my, I don't know, all my expectations and all my assumptions or what I took away from other experiences. It's not as if I have access to this most of the time, but I know it's there. And that's really helpful because this idea that I am fundamentally broken is, I was able to remove it through that experience. And it also gives me insight into other people because I know that if I have that, then everyone else does too. And so everyone is this kind of perfect essence covered up with layers and layers and layers of shit. And, some of that shit is easier to deal with than other. And so, it doesn't mean that people are perfect beings because there's still all this life stuff that's covering up their essence, but it's there. So I find that helpful. I also that was the beginning of me understanding the difference between intellectualizing things and understanding them in my body, in experience, and that the intellectual understanding of something can only take you so far. So, my 20 years of therapy took me as far as they did, but I was still struggling. And this kind of experiential knowing that, like, this is true and this is there is just a different way of approaching the same information. And yeah, it was the beginning of realizing that, like, I'm not going to intellectualize my way out of my depression. Like, this is going to have to be an experiential solution. And this is why meditation is so important and why sort of being in the moment is so important. And it's really through mindfulness and the benefits that these kinds of practices bring that's going to be the way out.
Oh. And so it sounds like your relationship to yourself has changed a lot, and you brought in mindfulness practices and other ways to stay connected to what you learned and what you know to be true. I'm curious if your relationship to spirituality or to your transpersonal sense of self has shifted or evolved or changed through some of these experiences.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And so, going back to my original experiences, like I said, there wasn't any sort of explicit spiritual component. And it is something that over the 20 years after that, I started to cultivate through meditation. And I was lucky to have access to some very wise mentors and therapy and what have you. And so, yeah, I think back then I didn't have a good sense of what spirituality was at all, and I had a better sense going into this later experience. But even with that, it has changed a great deal in the years since that second experience. In part, again, because of what I just described, this idea between, like, the head knowing and the heart knowing, and that they're very much not the same thing. But also, my first experience of psychedelics as medicine, or I guess, like, with the explicit intention of using it as medicine, because, it was medicine before too. I wasn't paying attention. So MDMA was the first of those, but there have also been, similar experiences with psilocybin and other plant medicines. And I'm finding that my experiences with MDMA tend to tell me about myself and parts of myself and versions of myself that are in there. And, I've experienced more grown up versions of that essential being in there. And that really helps me manage the parts that are in there and how I think about myself. But I find that with plant medicine, I get a lot of lessons about the universe and truth. And so that feels much more spiritual, just getting a much more embodied understanding of, what does it mean that we're all connected, and what is there beyond our minds. And so I've gotten a lot of insights I mean, I say a lot of insights for me, but probably only a very small fraction of truth. But I find it very helpful. And those kinds of lessons, the lessons about like what is the truth of the universe, those are really helpful for cultivating gratitude and joy and, understanding how everything is connected and what my part is, and that I have a part in it, right? And that I'm actually not separate somehow or left out of the universe. Yeah, I'm a part of it just as much as everyone else. And how many of the things that I experience are gifts from the rest of the world that we're connected to. So those kinds of insights come from plant medicine for me, and that has changed my ability to be present and experience joy and experience compassion, and that's really helpful too.
I love that. I love how you describe the lessons and the truths that you're experiencing with plant medicines now, today, and how that kind of echoes how you found this space in the first place. Finding community and connection and a place and belonging. There's I'm hearing a parallel.
Yeah, that's a really lovely point. I like that.
Hmm, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And I think like maybe it was trying to give me those lessons at the time too, right? That like you're part of something, but I was more focused on the something at the time than like my part in it. And so yeah, it's nice that the message came through more fully on the second
Mhm.
one.
Yeah.
And just to explain the hokey book title, the opening of dimensions. So like it comes back to me to like seeing my psyche in 3 dimensions, but then also now beginning to understand the dimension, like these much vaster dimensions of the universe and the universal truths.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Doris, for sharing your experiences and the evolution in your experiencing with these substances. I'm curious, as we wrap up, what's what's one thing you wish you had known before taking psychedelics, either in that rave era or in the more intentional, or both?
What's something I wish I had known? Um, I'm not sure how to answer that because I feel like in both phases, psychedelics served a purpose that showed up exactly when it needed to. And so, yeah, it's a tricky one to answer. It's actually wild how my first therapeutic, like explicitly, intentionally therapeutic experience came to be. I really feel like the universe arranged that for me. There's just so many factors that came together that didn't have to come together that created the possibility for this session to happen on my 40th birthday. Well, for it to happen at all, and then for it to happen on my 40th birthday. And so I truly think that it came at exactly the moment that it needed to. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what I wish I had known before, but I do have a strong sense of what I wish other people knew. And that's also different between the two chapters because I remember, when it was still party time, I would say that I thought everybody needed to experience psychedelics at least once and also go to therapy at least once. And it was around this idea that, your reality and your way of understanding the world isn't the reality or the way of understanding the world. And I think it's very evident when we take psychedelics, even in a party setting, that well, your reality shifts, and you can't deny that the way you operate in the day-to-day world is the only way to operate in this world. And so I think it opens the understanding of other people's viewpoints. It opens a curiosity of what is someone else's reality, and with the understanding that it's probably not the same as yours. And, same with therapy too. Just like realizing that, and like even for yourself, realizing that your day-to-day experience doesn't explain everything about you or your life. Like, you don't have yourself figured out, you don't have your life figured out. And, you can't speak with certainty about who you are or why you do things. And I think psychedelics and therapy both get you to question those assumptions. And yeah, that's kind of one of the messages from it. But then the messages from the second phase are much vaster, and it's things I've already mentioned. This idea that we have this perfect essence inside of us, and it's covered up with a lifetime of shit. I think it's helpful in understanding anyone else who feels broken. I think it's helpful for them to understand that that's available, and it also opens up compassion for other people and understanding. And other people are difficult and do difficult things, but at least you can separate them difficult experiences from them being difficult as being a difficult person. So you can separate their actions and their kind of assumptions and experiences from their essence, which is helpful. And again, I have been able to cultivate so much gratitude and concern for the rest of the world. And again, it comes down to compassion and joy. And I think these are just really great tools for experiencing gratitude and compassion and what have you without necessarily having words for it. So again, like, it's not the kind of intellectual, like, oh, I should care because I don't know, I care about animals or because the planet is burning, but like it's an internal feeling that you carry with yourself all the time that you don't even need words for. And that feels much more valuable and real than any words you might carry with you. So I think those are big things to take away from these experiences. And I don't know if I wish I'd known them before. I'm just really grateful that I know them now and can practice with those and work with those. And it really gives me a path, a much better path than the intellectualizing ever did, of like what feels true and what feels right and what feels like the way I want to be in this world and show up in this world. So
Hmm.
yeah, I guess I have more gratitude than, like, wishful thinking about the before.
That's beautiful. Well, Doris, thank you for sharing your light with us.
Yeah. Aw, yeah, you're very welcome. Shining it
Yeah.
out.
This was such a beautiful conversation. It was so lovely to hear about how you came to psychedelics and how your relationship has evolved over time. Do you have any parting words, any parting thoughts before we wrap up our conversation today?
No, I was gonna make the bad joke that it's been a journey connecting. Haha. But no, I feel like the parting thoughts are what I, said. And, I think we'd probably be much better off if other people had access to these insights. I don't think they need to come with psychedelics all the time. I think, through contemplative practices or, meditation or other ways, you can access those insights. So, yeah, I think I'm more interested in the world accessing those insights than necessarily psychedelics, but I really do think this is the way through and out for us.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for
Thank
the
you. Thanks for
conversation.
letting me tell the story.
Yeah, it was really an honor. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you.